Welcome back to this video in Prowler for AWS Security series. In this video, we'll be talking about how we can customize Prowler checks. We'll be looking at Prowler config files. We will look at how to execute checks for a particular AWS service. And we will finally look at how we can enable and disable checks. A good number of Prowler checks could be configured. I'm not talking about all the checks, but a good number of them, especially when it has a certain number associated with that. For example, let's say we are talking about log retention check. The recommended duration for log retention is 365 days. Maybe if you want to customize that and increase it to 500 days, probably you can do that. Another example is updating unused access key dates from 45 days to 90 days, or maybe reduce it to 20 or 30 days. Another common example which could be very customized to your environment is a port, a high-risk port that your developers often expose to the internet. You can add those ports to the high-risk ports category. So in the next Prowler scan, it checks all the security groups and sees if that particular sensitive or high-risk port is open to the internet. The configuration file looks something like this. We'll be looking at the entire config file in a moment. One thing to note here is every installation of Prowler, be it using pip or using brew, each installation would contain its own default config file. So in the previous demos, you should have seen a message like this where it says that it's using following configuration. It is using config file, which is saved under Brew's location, and a mute file. We'll be looking at mute file in a future video. But for now, you need to note that there is a default config file for every Prowler installation. Let's take a quick look into the config file. Let me just go to the previous scan. It says this is the config file. So under AWS, there are multiple configurations. So under AWS, there is mute non-default regions, EC2 allowed interface types, log retention, log group retention days is 365, obsolete Lambda runtimes. So there are multiple options that you can go ahead and customize it. An interesting part of this config file is it's not that a single variable is associated with, say, a single check. There could be variables which are associated with multiple checks. Example, showdone API key. By default, we are not supplying any showdone API key. The default is set to null. Let's say if you want to enable showdone feature in your Prowler scans, you can add your API key here. You can edit this config file, create a new config file based on this and add your API key there. And this API key will be used by multiple internet exposure checks. Now, if you want to customize the config, a recommended approach is create a copy of the default config file. Then execute this command where you say like -config file and you give the config file name. Let's say if you want to execute Prowler for specific AWS services, you can do that as well. You can just type in Prowler AWS list services. It gives a list of services that's supported. So right now there are 67 available services. And now if you want to go ahead and execute all the checks for a particular service that are available in Prowler, you can just do Prowler AWS services and let's say S3. Let me also give the profile name. So now it executes all the checks that are related to S3 service across all the regions because I have not given region here. So by default, it takes all the regions. And you can see here 31 failures in which one is high and 25 are medium. Coming back to the presentation, there's an option to do the opposite of it. You could check for all the services, excluding a few services. For example, this command will execute all the checks for all the services, excluding EC2 and RDS. Now let's talk about individual checks. In the previous video, I've already given a glimpse of how it would look like. You could list all the checks. There were around 300 checks. And to execute individual check, you can just use Prowler AWS -- checks and the check name, the exact name that you can get from this output. And there's an option to do the exact opposite. For example, if you want to exclude certain checks and execute all the others, then you can use the option excluded checks. So now there's a question for you. Prowler comes with 300 plus checks that gets executed by default. What if you need to selectively execute 100 checks? You can pause the video for now and think about it. In the previous slide, I showed how you can execute certain checks, right? You can always go ahead and say Prowler AWS checks, check 1 space, check 2 space, check 3, and you can mention all the checks. You can do that. There's nothing wrong with it, but there's a better way to do this. Let's say you selected all the 100 checks. You can create something called checks file. It's a JSON file in this particular format. We can go ahead, create this checks file.json and mention all the 100 checks that we want, and then execute Prowler to go ahead and use this checks file. So we say Prowler AWS checks file and give the file path, and it will go ahead and execute those checks. That's it in this video. In the next video, we are going to talk about mute list, another powerful feature in Prowler. If you have any doubts with this video, just comment it below. See you in the next one.